Sorry. So what will happen if the bond doesn't pass? Then what happens?
So let me tell you first what it would do if it did pass. If it passes, the five propositions will essentially allow us to do things like renovate every single campus in some form or fashion all across the ISD, and we have roughly 230 campuses. It'll make sure that we have technology all across our city. And if the pandemic taught us anything about education, one major thing it did teach us is that our kids don't have internet, and it's very difficult for them to be able to connect during this pandemic. So we will work towards universal broadband with these bond monies. It'll allow us to do things like make sure that our air conditions at schools work, make sure that if there's asbestos in some of these old schools, and there tends to be cases of that in schools that are, were built in the early 1900s, we can clean that stuff up. It'll allow us to do things like creating a performance art facility so that our kids have access to world-class performance arts capabilities. And it'll do things like inject racial equity into our policy planning, into our facilities. We've created something called the Community Resource Index that allows us to then target disinvestment that has been due to historical disinvestment and historical policy planning, and go into those communities and expand our facilities to basically plug in opportunity gaps in these communities. So Nancy, that really answers your question. If it passes, that's what it will do. If it doesn't, then that means that there are roughly $6 billion of needs that will not go addressed. And that's just not good for our kids.
Well, I mean, I think some people are saying that's all well and good. Of course we want equity. Of course we want better facilities. Of course it would be really nice to have a performing arts center for public school kids. But really, right now, in the time of Corona, when the economy is so shaky, I mean, is this the right time to be passing such an enormous bond? I mean, so what do you say about that?
First, I mean, it's a very fair question. We're all taxpayers. It's a question that I had myself as we were going through the process once the pandemic ultimately began to impact the economy the way that it has. I think it's very important for viewers to understand, though, what a bond does and what a bond doesn't do, and how the administration and the board actually control the bond. So Dallas ISD basically funds our education, both the programming in the school and the facilities where the programming happens, through two different buckets of property tax. One of them is our maintenance and operation tax rate. We ask you to give us money to be able to pay for teachers, to be able to pay for curriculum, and so on and so forth. And then our interest and sinking tax rate. And that's not as large a tax, and it's tax that allows us to be able to pay off bonds so that we can keep our facilities in a good state. We have the 24th, we rank 24 out of not many more school districts in the North Texas region when it comes to INS tax rates. So we're actually undertaxing you relative to our peers. So that's one important thing to understand, is that we already have a very reasonable tax burden as it stands. The second thing is, when we issue a bond, we plan that bond in order to make sure that we don't raise your taxes. And so we're going to, what in the bond business they call amortize, extend the life of the sales of these bonds over the course of 30 years. So as we go to pay back the bond, we will be paying at a tax rate that we believe is not going to ever need to be increased. If the economy decreases, if the economy continues to be impacted by COVID for an extended amount of time, we also don't have to sell these bonds. And if we don't sell these bonds, that's another way for us to ensure that we are not raising your taxes. So that's the way the way I think about it is, there are so many checks in place, and we've planned this bond with conservative assumptions to really ensure that we don't ever have to ask you to raise your taxes.
So why did the state legislature require that goes on the ballot? It's so confusing.
Politics.
But what is the advantage of that for them? What was their thinking?
So last legislative session, in an attempt to try to get a unanimous vote, both in the House and in the Senate, when it came to our school finance reform bill, there were a small group of, fiscal hawks on the far right of the conservative contingent in the legislature that basically said, if you want our votes, you need to compromise. And so there was a compromise that was made that basically said anytime that a municipal institution wants to issue debt, we have to say to the voters that this is going to be a property tax increase, regardless of whether it is or it isn't going to be one. And I know that sounds nutty, but I think you also know how our Texas legislature works. And so as an attempt to try to get a unanimous vote, the far right element of the party forced this into the final language of the bill. And so that's why we are having now to have to explain to voters that it actually won't be a tax rate increase. And if there's anyone that has a question as to, well, how could they get away with it? Their rationale is essentially that if you extend debt over the course of, some years, and that debt accrues interest, then down the road, you may be, a government entity may ask people to pay off that interest by increasing their taxes. So maybe it could be a tax increase. We're not going to do that because of how we've planned the bond and the conservative assumptions that we've made, and the fact that interest rates right now are very low, and we hope that they will remain for a little bit longer as we begin to issue this initial tranche of debt. So it's politics, and they get away with it every single session.